The boy couldn't have been older than 11, maybe 12 at most, and he was standing in the middle of the hotel lobby like he'd walked in from a different century. That was what struck Leonard Ashby first. Not the mud on the child's sneakers, not the torn sleeve of his jacket, not even the way his eyes moved around the room the way eyes do when a person is trying to memorize escape routes. It was the stillness of him, the absolute unnatural stillness of a child who had learned very early that taking up too much space was dangerous. Leonard was on his way to a dinner he didn't want to attend. The kind of dinner where men in expensive suits talked about money they already had and how to make more of it. And everyone laughed at the right moments, and nobody said anything true. He had been doing those dinners for 22 years. He was very good at them now in the way a person becomes good at things they never wanted to be good at. He almost walked past the boy. Almost. But then the child looked up, and for one fraction of a second, before the careful blankness came back down over his face like a curtain, Leonard saw something in those dark eyes that stopped him cold. It was grief. The clean, undisguised grief of someone who has lost something and doesn't yet fully understand that it's gone. Leonard knew that look. He had worn it himself for 3 years. He stopped walking. The boy's name was Felix. Leonard wouldn't learn that for another few minutes, and he wouldn't learn the rest of it. The full weight of what Felix carried. For much longer than that. But in that moment in the lobby of the Pemberton Hotel on a Thursday evening in late October, Leonard Ashby stopped walking toward a dinner he didn't want to attend, and he turned around. "Are you lost?" he asked. The boy considered the question with a seriousness that felt entirely out of place on a child's face. "No," Felix said. "I know exactly where I am." Leonard bought him a sandwich from the hotel cafe, and then another one when the first disappeared in under 4 minutes. He bought him a hot chocolate too, and Felix wrapped both hands around the cup the way children do. The way Leonard's daughter used to, back when she was small enough to hold cups with 2 hands, and Leonard had to look away for a moment. They sat in 2 armchairs near the window. Outside, the street was gray and wet. Halifax in October. "Where's your family?" Leonard asked. "My mom's at work," Felix said. He said it quickly, the way children say things they've rehearsed. "She works nights. I was supposed to go to my neighbor's, but Mrs. Patterson wasn't home. So you came here." "It's warm," Felix said without embarrassment. There was a directness to him that Leonard found disarming. Most adults, in uncomfortable situations, performed. They apologized or explained or deflected. Felix simply stated things as they were, and then waited to see what happened next. "What does your mom do?" Leonard asked. "She works at a cleaning company. They send her to different buildings." Felix paused. "She used to be a teacher. Back home. Where's home?" "Here now," Felix said. Then, after a moment, "Before here was Toronto. Before Toronto was Calgary. We move around." Leonard nodded slowly. He understood, without asking, that this was not the moving around of people who chose to move around. He was reaching for his phone to call someone. He wasn't sure who, maybe the concierge, maybe someone who would know the right thing to do. When Felix set down his hot chocolate, looked directly at Leonard's left hand, and said, very calmly, "That watch. My dad had one exactly like that." Leonard went still. He looked down at his wrist. The watch was a Patek Philippe, steel case, navy dial, the kind of watch that was not mass-produced, that was not something 2 people simply happened to own. His wife had given it to him on their 15th anniversary, 2 months before the accident. He had never taken it off. "What did you say?" he said. Felix wasn't looking at the watch anymore. He was looking at Leonard's face, reading it with that unsettling ancient gravity of his. "My dad had a watch like that," the boy said again. He called it his forever watch. He said it was the only thing he'd ever bought himself that he didn't feel guilty about. He paused. "I haven't seen my dad in 3 years." The lobby seemed to tilt slightly. Leonard set his phone down on the arm of the chair. "What's your dad's name?" he said, and he was surprised by how steady his voice was. "James," Felix said. "James Whitfield." The name meant nothing to Leonard immediately. Whitfield was not an uncommon name, but there was something, some faint, nagging something, that kept him from dismissing it. He stayed with Felix for another hour, longer than he had planned, longer than made any rational sense. He told himself he was simply making sure the child was safe until his mother could be reached. He told himself that. He was not quite convinced. Felix talked, once he understood that Leonard was genuinely listening. He talked the way children talk when they have been holding things for too long, in bursts, in circles, doubling back to add details, stopping suddenly when he got close to the parts that hurt. His mother's name was Vera. She was 34. She had emigrated from Ukraine 10 years ago with her husband, who was Canadian, and who had, according to Felix, simply stopped coming home one day 3 years ago. "Did he leave?" Leonard asked. "That's what my mom says." Felix turned his cup in his hands. "But she doesn't say it like she believes it. What does she believe?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. "She believes something happened to him," he said. "She doesn't say that either. But I can tell." Leonard asked him about the watch again, gently, careful not to push. Felix described it in detail that was startling. Steel, navy face, small seconds dial at 6 o'clock. A small scratch on the caseback that his dad had gotten trying to fix it himself once, before admitting he had no idea what he was doing, which had made Felix laugh. Leonard turned his wrist over. There was a small scratch on the caseback. He had gotten it 3 years ago, trying to fix it himself, before giving up and taking it to a jeweler. The room tilted again. He stood up abruptly and said he needed to make a phone call, and he walked to the far side of the lobby on legs that felt strange, and he called his assistant, and he said, "I need you to find out everything you can about a man named James Whitfield. Canadian. Married a Ukrainian immigrant, named Vera. Has a son named Felix. Used to live in Calgary, then Toronto, now possibly Halifax, and I need it tonight." His assistant, who had worked for him for 11 years and who had learned not to ask certain questions, said, "I'll start now." Leonard Ashby was 61 years old. He had built a real estate development company from one property in New Brunswick into a portfolio that spanned 4 provinces. He had been married for 19 years to a woman named Diana, who had died in a car accident on the Trans-Canada Highway on a November evening 3 years ago, and he had not been the same person since. He knew this. His daughter knew this. His board of directors knew this, though they were careful about how they mentioned it. Diana had been his anchor, not in the soft, decorative way that phrase usually meant. She had been the actual structural thing, the thing that kept him from drifting into whatever version of himself existed without warmth or proportion. Without her, he had become competent and empty, which was its own particular kind of loss. The dinner that evening had gone unattended. He had texted his apologies and stayed in the hotel, ordering coffee he didn't drink and sitting in the chair Felix had vacated. He had given the boy his business card before Felix's mother called. She had sounded exhausted and frightened, and then relieved, and then frightened again, and he had arranged for a car to take them both home safely. He had watched Felix leave the lobby. The boy had turned once at the door and looked back, and Leonard had raised a hand. Felix had raised his hand too. Then he was gone. The assistant called back at 11:47. James Whitfield, 41 years old, born in Fredericton, New Brunswick, graduated from Dalhousie University, worked in environmental consulting for 12 years, married Vera Kovalenko in Halifax 9 years ago. One son, Felix James Whitfield, born 8 years ago, reported missing 3 years ago by his wife. Case listed as open, inactive. Last known location, a work site in northern Ontario, outside a town called Hearst, where he'd been conducting an environmental assessment for a resource development project. The company that had contracted him for that project was a subsidiary of a development firm based in Toronto. The development firm was a subsidiary of Ashby Capital Group. Leonard read that last part twice. Then he sat very still for a long time, in the way that people sit when the floor has changed shape beneath them and they are not yet sure how to move. He did not sleep that night. He went through files, old files from 3 years back, from the period when Diana had just died, and he had handed over large portions of operational control to his VP, a man named Curtis Greer, who had since left the company under circumstances that had seemed straightforward at the time, and now did not seem straightforward at all. He found the project, Northern Ontario Environmental Clearance, a compressed timeline that had raised flags internally, and then somehow stopped raising flags. He found communications that had been seeded to his address and never read. He had not been reading much in those months. He found a report that had been filed and then superseded by a second report with different conclusions and a name at the bottom of the first report. J. Whitfield. The first report said the site had significant contamination risks and should not be approved for development without extensive remediation. The development had proceeded on schedule. Leonard closed the laptop. He sat in the dark for a long time. In the morning, he called Vera Whitfield. She was not what he expected. He wasn't sure what he had expected. The word victim carried a shape in his mind that Vera immediately and thoroughly dismantled. She was direct in the way Felix was direct, which told him something about where the boy had learned it. She was wary. She asked him twice how he had found her number, and listened carefully to both times he answered, checking for inconsistency. "Your son was in my hotel lobby last night," Leonard said. "He told me about his father. He described my watch." Silence on the line. "Mrs. Whitfield," Leonard said. "I think something happened to your husband in connection with a project my company was involved in. I need to understand what happened, and I think you may have information that I don't have, and I may have information that you don't have." More silence. He waited, because he understood instinctively that pushing her would accomplish nothing. "Felix talks too much," she said finally, but her voice had shifted. "He talks the right amount," Leonard said. "He's trying to find his father. He's been trying for 3 years, she exhaled. He heard something in it that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. The sound of a person who has been carrying a very heavy thing and has just been offered the possibility, not yet the certainty, of being able to set it down. "When can we meet?" she said. They met at a coffee shop in the North End, neutral territory. Vera came in with Felix at her side, the boy wearing the same jacket with the torn sleeve, looking at Leonard with the complicated expression of a child who is hoping and is also afraid to hope. Leonard stood when they came in. Vera was small and precise in her movements, with dark circles under her eyes that spoke of years rather than nights. She sat down, put her hands flat on the table, and said, "Tell me what you know," Leonard told her. All of it. The project, the reports, the compressed timeline, Curtis Greer, the communications he had not read in his grief. He told her without softening it or managing it, because she deserved the unmanaged version. Felix sat beside her and listened with that same terrible gravity. When Leonard finished, Vera was quiet for a moment. Then she opened her bag and took out a folder. "James sent me this," she said, 2 days before he disappeared. "He said if anything ever happened to him, I should keep it somewhere no one would look." She paused. "I've been keeping it for 3 years. Inside the folder was a copy of the original environmental report, the real one, with handwritten margin notes in a script that was quick and angular, the handwriting of someone thinking fast. There were names. There were dates. There was a record of a conversation James Whitfield had tried to report to a regulatory body and had been redirected, twice, to internal channels that led nowhere. There was also a photograph. James at the work site, standing in front of equipment, squinting into the sun. He was wearing a watch. Leonard looked at the photograph for a long time. "We need to find him," he said. "I've been trying to find him for 3 years," Vera said. Her voice was steady and exhausted and furious all at once. "I know," Leonard said, "but now you have something you didn't have before." "What's that?" "Someone who knows how the money moved." It took 4 months. Leonard hired investigators, not the kind who took 3 weeks to return a call, but the kind who had previously worked for people who could not afford to wait. He retained 2 lawyers who specialized in exactly the kind of corporate liability that was slowly taking shape in the documentation. He went back through 3 years of operational records, with the patience of someone who understood that the truth, when it had been buried, did not reveal itself quickly. It revealed itself in increments, in small, unremarkable details that only mattered when you put them next to other small, unremarkable details. Curtis Greer had, it emerged, been managing a side arrangement with the development partners. James Whitfield's original report would have delayed the project by 18 months and reduced the return on investment substantially. Greer had arranged for the report to be suppressed and for James to be, the word in the internal communications was managed, which turned out to mean discredited, isolated, and ultimately threatened when he refused to be discredited or isolated. What had happened to James Whitfield after the worksite was less clear, and for 2 months it remained the thing that Leonard could not resolve, that sat in the middle of everything like a closed door. Felix called him sometimes. This had not been planned. Leonard had given the boy his number in case of emergency, and Felix had a somewhat expansive definition of emergency that Leonard found he did not mind at all. They talked about small things. The boy was reading a book about migratory birds. He had learned, he reported, that Arctic terns flew from pole to pole every year and back again, the longest migration of any animal on Earth. He found this information comforting, he said, though he couldn't fully explain why. Maybe because it means the distance doesn't have to be permanent, Leonard said. Felix considered this. Yeah, he said, maybe that. James Whitfield was alive. He had been alive the entire time. He was living under a different name in a small town outside of Thunder Bay, Ontario, where he had been for 2 years and 8 months. He had not contacted his family because he had been told, specifically and credibly, that doing so would put them in danger. He had believed this, and he had stayed away, and it had cost him something that Leonard could see immediately when they met. A person who has been separated from the people they love for nearly 3 years acquires a particular kind of damage, a thinning of something that is not quite hope and not quite will, but is adjacent to both. His name under these circumstances was David Cole. He worked at a hardware store. He was quiet and careful, and he looked, Leonard thought, like a man who had stopped expecting anything. Leonard sat across from him in the back of the hardware store after hours on a Tuesday evening, and he said, "Your son described your watch to me, down to the scratch on the caseback." James stared at him. "He's 11 now," Leonard said. "He's reading about migratory birds. His mother works nights so she can pay rent. They've moved 3 times in 3 years. He paused. "The people who threatened you, they're not in a position to threaten anyone anymore. There are lawyers involved now, and investigators, and the regulatory body you tried to report to 3 years ago has been contacted by people who are harder to redirect than you were." He paused again. "It's over, James." The man across from him, James Whitfield, who had been David Cole for nearly 3 years, who had been a father and a husband, and a man with a watch he called his forever watch, put his face in his hands. Leonard waited. Outside, the parking lot of the hardware store was lit by a single sodium lamp that buzzed faintly. A car went past on the highway. After a while, James looked up. "Is he okay?" he said. "Felix, is he okay?" "He's more okay than he has any right to be," Leonard said. "He's extraordinary, actually. He found me in a hotel lobby, and he just decided I was going to help him. He didn't ask permission, he just decided." Something crossed James Whitfield's face that Leonard recognized. It was pride and grief and love, all compressed into a single expression that was almost too much to look at directly. "That's Felix," James said quietly. "That's Felix," Leonard agreed. Vera did not cry when she saw James. This surprised people later, when the story, fragments of it, the parts that were safe to tell, became something that people occasionally told each other. They expected tears, Leonard supposed, because that was what the shape of the story seemed to call for. What Vera did instead was stand very still in the doorway of the apartment in Halifax for a long moment, looking at her husband, and then she said, "You should have trusted me." James said, "I know. I would have found a way." "I know," James said again. His voice broke slightly on the second word. Felix was not still at all. Felix crossed the room in the way that children cross rooms when they have been waiting for something for a very long time, and the waiting is finally over. Without caution, without ceremony, at full speed. He hit his father somewhere around the midsection and wrapped his arms around him and pressed his face into his father's jacket, and James Whitfield folded over his son and held on. Leonard was standing in the hallway. He had driven them here. He had wanted to, and neither Vera nor James had argued, but he had not planned to come inside. He had been about to say goodbye when Vera had simply turned and said, "Come in a tone that made it clear this was not optional. He stood in the hallway of this small apartment in Halifax while a family came back together in the room beyond, and he felt something that he had not felt in 3 years. Not happiness exactly, not his own happiness, which still lived somewhere distant and complicated, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a person who has carried a stone for a very long time and has just watched someone else set theirs down. He thought about Diana. He thought about her more easily here, somehow, than he usually did. He thought about the watch she had given him, the forever watch, and the scratch on the caseback, and a small boy in a hotel lobby who had pointed at his wrist and said, "My dad had one exactly like that." And who had not known, could not have known, what thread he was pulling. He thought about Arctic terns, the longest migration of any animal on Earth. Pole to pole and back again, every year, without fail. The distance doesn't have to be permanent. Vera came back into the hallway. She stood beside Leonard, and they both looked into the small living room, where James was sitting on the floor with Felix in his lap, both of them talking at once, both of them laughing at something. The lamplight warm and ordinary in the way that ordinary things become extraordinary when they have been absent long enough. "Thank you," Vera said. "Your son found me," Leonard said. "I just followed." She looked at him for a moment with an expression that was difficult to name. Gratitude, yes, but something else underneath it. Recognition, maybe. The way people look at each other when they understand, without needing to explain it, that grief has a shape, and that the shape is sometimes surprisingly useful. "He does that," she said. "He finds people." Leonard looked at Felix, who had climbed off his father's lap and was now apparently explaining, with great urgency in both hands, something about migratory birds. "He found the right one," Leonard said. Outside, the October light was fading over the harbor. In the living room, Felix was laughing again, full and unself-conscious, the laugh of a child who has remembered how, and the sound of it moved through the apartment like something long overdue, like the first warm day after a winter that had gone on too long, like the moment a door opens that you had stopped believing would ever open again.